I think that there's a really big misconception in podcasting and personal branding and business in general that social media is the only way to grow. If you don't have a big following or audience on social media, nothing else is going to work. And this simply is not true. When I look at my own monthly revenue and my clients that pay me every month and have a standing contract, do you know how I met 100% of those clients? It wasn't social media. It wasn't a cute little video that I made on TikTok. It was in-person and virtual networking. It was talking to people and sending those follow-up messages and introducing myself and getting out of my comfort zone to tell people what I do. 100% of my monthly revenue from ongoing clients in 2024 came from networking of some kind. But what does this have to do with podcasting and specifically growing your podcast? I'm telling you this to remind you that there is more than one way to skin a cat. If you can grow a business without social media, you can definitely grow a podcast audience without social media. And in this episode, I'm going to tell you exactly how to do it. Hello and welcome to Podcast for Profit. My name is Morgan Franklin. I'm a podcast producer, strategist, and educator. This podcast will help you create and grow a podcast that cuts through the noise of social media and speaks directly to your target audience. If you're ready to create a podcast that will align you with the experts in your industry, position yourself as a trusted leader, and create another source of revenue for your business, you're in the right place. Let's do an exercise together. I want to take just a moment. We're going to breathe in and hold it and breathe out and think about how you find a podcast. That's it. Let's say that you have a long road trip or you're about to start cleaning your entire house, or like me, you have about 200 hours of mindless labor left on your Halloween costume. Whatever it is, you need to find a new podcast. How would you go about finding this podcast to listen to? Seriously, how would you find this podcast? Normally, as podcast listeners, we're going through a cycle of a few different things. The first one being we've asked around, and whether that's on social media or through our work or school week, we're asking the people around us, hey, have you listened to any good podcasts? And we're writing those titles down, or we're trying to save them in our notes, or we're struggling to remember them later. If you're like me, I'm always trying to remember, what was that podcast that somebody told me about? It's either that or we've had a suggestion forced upon us, right? I am definitely that friend. I am so annoying. I cannot like something just a normal amount. I'm either 1,000% obsessed over this thing, or I have never heard what you're trying to tell me about. In my experience, a lot of podcast recommendations and first-time podcast listeners come from word of mouth, from your friend telling you, hey, you should listen to this podcast. There is truly no better advertising than a referral. And that is true for most professional settings, and it's definitely true for podcasting. I know in this episode specifically, we're talking about how to market and grow your podcast off social media. So I'm sorry to bring this up, but I want to remind you to share your reviews. Anytime anyone says anything nice about your podcast, put it on full display on your social media, on your website, wherever you can. We trust consumers more than we trust the creator. So make sure you're always showing off your fans and followers. And plus, it makes them feel so good. Like, you know how it feels to be recognized by the people that you love their work. So give your listeners that same opportunity. Okay, but let's say that you've asked around and you called your friend that listens to literally every podcast and no one has any recommendations for you. The next most common way, at least for me, to find a new podcast to listen to is in-app. I open Apple Podcasts, I open Spotify, I open GoodPod, whatever it may be, and I'm searching for a topic or I'm looking around on the charts to see what looks good and what I might want to listen to. So let's stop right there, because this is something too many podcasters are just glossing right over. And if I'm going to be honest, I did in the beginning too. We think that we can just promote our way out of being unsearchable on a podcast app, and that simply is not true. Let's say, and this is an easy example for me because one of my podcasts is in this category, so I can speak to it. You have a podcast about nursing homes, long-term care, senior living, and how to pay for care over the age of 65. Riveting stuff, I know. If that's what your podcast is about, Someone better be able to type in senior living and your podcast pop up in the first 4 podcasts. They better be able to type in long-term care and your podcast is right there. If your podcast is for quilters, let's say, your listener better be able to type in quilting and your podcast is the first one to pop up. I have a whole episode about this and I'll link it for you in the episode description, but it is episode 19 of this podcast and it's called Podcast SEO, Your Guide to Higher Rankings. As some of you might know, if you've listened to the podcast before, I worked in SEO as my first job straight out of college, so I'm very familiar with it. But, over the past year, I've learned a lot of things that are specifically pertinent to these apps that you need to know that is not just standard SEO. So definitely give that episode a listen if you are trying to grow organically on either Google or in the apps. But since we're here are a few things I'd start on today if I wanted someone to open Spotify and type in podcasting, for example, and this show pop up, which by the way, it does, not to brag, but I do know what I'm talking about. The first thing is you're going to want to look at the title of your podcast. Does this podcast name have any words in it that anyone would be searching for? I know I've said this before, and I'll say it again. SEO does not reward creativity, but God, I wish it did. The next thing is, do the names of your episodes have anything to do with what you're talking about? Are there any words in the titles of your episodes that have anything to do with what your listener might be typing in that search bar? Because you have 2 opportunities here. You have the ability to rank for your show and the name of your show, and then also for your episodes. So you need to be showing up at one or both of these. After that, I need you to go back and transcribe every single episode. And I know that this is not going to be fun. It's not fun to do it every week. It's not fun to do a backlog. And you might be thinking, well, Morgan, Apple Podcasts and Spotify will transcribe my episodes. And while that might be true, the rest of the hosts are not doing that. And I can speak from personal experience. When I forget to transcribe an episode, it will impact the rankings that I have and the searchability for that episode on both Apple Podcasts and Spotify, which both tell me that they are transcribing my episodes. But why are the episodes not ranking that I don't transcribe? Riddle me this. So anyway, I do not trust Apple Podcasts or Spotify. Do your own transcriptions. Lastly, for our purposes here, like I said, I have an entire episode about podcast SEO linked for you in the episode description, but please, please, please write episode descriptions that are as detailed and keyword specific as possible. If this episode, let's say, is for quilters, about finding that perfect holiday fabric, I want every single word that could possibly be about that someone would be searching for in that episode description. And of course, the episode description is what the episode is about. That is what you attach when you are uploading your file and the name of your episode. The episode description is what is going along with that. Having visibility on podcasting apps is one of the most critical ways that any podcaster will grow and build visibility for their podcast. If you need help with this, please feel free to send me an email or send me a message on my website. My email is morgan@morganfranklin.media, or my website is in the episode description. I have hourly coaching options. I would love to help you out with this. All right, so let's say we called our friend who loves podcasts. They have no recommendations for us. They can't tell us anything. We search Spotify and Apple Podcasts. We have nothing. So what's next? For me, it is searching on Google. It's seeing what other people have to say or what other kind of recommendations are out there. Now, could this lead us into the social media space? Absolutely, it could. But honestly, for me, most of the time, I'm looking at articles. I'm looking at lists of podcast recommendations online. I want to know what other people have to say and what their rankings on these different podcasts and what their full, complete thought is. But how can you take advantage of this, especially as a new podcaster, especially as a podcaster that might not have a lot of clout on social media or anywhere else? Like, you're probably not going to be featured in any blogs. So how can you take advantage of this? Send an email, send a message on LinkedIn or Instagram or wherever you have to do it. Get scrappy with it. You have no idea how many blogs and different news sources, and I'll say news sources in quotes, I've sent a message to saying, hey, I saw you haven't updated your list of podcasts for podcasters since 2021. My name is Morgan. I'm a podcast producer. This is why you should feature my podcast on your revised list or updated list. Does it work every time? No, of course not. But has it worked? Yes. Yes, it has. Reaching out and having that connection with someone is so powerful. Then the next time they need a source, who are they calling? They're calling you. In the same vein is joining a website like Connectively, which was formerly Help a Reporter Out or Harrow, or Quoted. And make sure that you fill out all of the information to become a contributor for news and websites. Let me tell you how this works. We'll stick with the quilting example. But let's say that Cosmopolitan is looking for someone that can speak to quilting in 2025. They are most likely going to go to one of those two websites to put out an open call to contributors with their list of questions. And that is when you are going to come in and make your pitch and say, hey, I'm Morgan from Sir Quilts a Lot podcast, blah, blah, blah. And make sure it is featured in the article. So your podcast is featured in the article. So when someone sees, oh, they're talking about quilts in Cosmopolitan, that's so cool. They'll see, oh my gosh, she also has a podcast about quilting. That's awesome. I'm going to follow her. I'm going to listen to her podcast. So yes, promoting your podcast on social media is important for visibility and social proof, of course. But in my experience, meeting people and getting to know them and telling them about my podcast has been one of the most consistently effective ways to grow my audience. Get business cards made. Have your podcast information and your information on one side and a QR code for them to scan on the other side that goes directly to your podcast. And make sure that you listen to episode 8 of this podcast. Again, I will have it linked in the episode description, how to pitch your podcast to anyone in 30 seconds. This is a major hurdle for a lot of podcasters when they start talking about their podcast face-to-face. They just can't quite communicate the podcast well enough to convert that person that they've just had a conversation with into a listener. And that is totally understandable. So make sure that you have mastered the art of quickly being able to tell someone, hey, this is what my podcast is about. This is why you should listen. This is where you can listen. And most importantly, if you're trying to meet people face to face, be in the places where you can meet the people who would actually be interested in your podcast. Let's say I have a podcast about Dungeons and Dragons. It's not going to do me a ton of good if I go to a store about book scrapping, for example, and I'm passing out my cards and I'm talking about my podcast. While there might be a little bit of overlap in these two kinds of consumers, what would be great is if I went to a gaming store and started talking about my podcast. That would be much more effective and much more aligned to my target audience. So remember, put yourself in the situation with the people who are the most likely to be listening to this podcast. I produce anywhere from 4 to 6 interview-style podcast episodes per month. And I've met hundreds of people through interviewing and getting to know people through podcasts. Never underestimate the power of growing your podcasts through your guests and through the community that both you are surrounded with and your guests are surrounded by. Your guests should have such an amazing experience on your podcast that they want to tell their audience about you and about your show and, of course, about the episode that they did with you. As podcasters, I know we're busy. I know it is so hard just to put out an episode a week, and we forget to message people or to follow up. But this really should be a top priority, making that guest experience something that they will want to talk about. Make sure that you're giving them customized promotional material and you're supporting their business and you're making them feel welcome and seen. This is everything. For the majority of us, I think that we do somewhat become aware of podcasts through social media. But it's one of those scenarios that I explained in this episode that will actually bring us to subscribe and listen to the podcast and become a fan. So don't put all your eggs in the social media basket, and definitely don't let having a small social media presence hold you back from creating a podcast. Because that's not usually how people will find the podcast anyways. I'll tag all of the episodes that I talked about during this episode in the episode description. Wow, that is a lot of episodes. You can shop my podcast template store for a beautiful guest questionnaire if you want to really up-level that experience of sending guests their questions with a beautifully crafted PDF that's customizable in Canva. I'll have that linked for you. And as always, I can't wait to listen to your podcast. Hey, thank you so much for joining me on this episode. If you enjoyed the podcast and you'd like to hear more episodes like this one, go ahead and subscribe to the show. New episodes air every Monday morning. And if you found this episode valuable and you want to help other business owners and podcasters, will you leave me a 5-star review? It helps the show rank higher in the charts and brings more entrepreneurs the information they need to start making money on their podcast.